Dr. John Sommerville is no stranger to Christian study centers. As a professor of English history at the University of Florida, John helped establish the Christian Study Center of Gainesville. And now, as a retired professor at Durham, North Carolina, John is a member of the board and supports the ministry of the Center for Christianity and Scholarship, which is a study center at Duke University, a Christian study center there. John's given a lot of thought about the role that Christians, particularly Christian faculty, can play in public secular universities and how study centers can support Christians engaged in their work. So would you join me in welcoming John to speak to us tonight?
It's a real pleasure to be in Blacksburg, my first visit, and a pleasure to encourage you in your mission to the university. I love visiting college towns and sort of collecting them. I grew up in a college town, and I've never lived outside of a college town. I consider that a tremendous privilege. I want to do three things tonight. I want, briefly. First, I want to talk about the recent history of secular universities and why they're in a sort of decline. Second, I want to say what I think Christianity has to offer them, that they might be interested in considering. And third, I want to mention how the new Christian study centers around the country are trying to encounter them and change academic culture. I was very pleased to hear Dean say that changing academic culture was on the agenda from the very beginning. I don't think a lot of study centers have faced up to that possibility. You can already tell that I'm for universities and not against them. Universities were invented in the Christian Middle Ages. They don't go back to the ancient world. Many Christians feel they're now a threat to the faith. That doesn't have to be the case. And I'm not just talking about snatching souls away from them, but I'm talking about opening them up to Christian perspectives. And maybe I'd better repeat that phrase, opening them up to Christian perspectives, because that's what this talk is all about. So first, what's been happening to universities? I've lived through more than half of the entire history of secular research universities, which only began around 1900 in America. And thinking back, it seems to me that the hardest time to be a confident Christian in the secular university must have been about the late 50s, when academics were most sure of their place in the world. That was when the university's agenda was modernization, when the West was confident that it was leading the rest of the world and would be the model for everyone else in law, politics, economics, technology, medicine, education, scholarship. Religion wasn't going to be a part of this. Seriously religious people were still generally called fundamentalists. Evangelical was a neologism. Liberal Protestants at the time thought that Americanism summed up the Christian message. They didn't know what they had to offer the university that was distinctive, although the various denominations all maintained student religious centers close to campus. But then came the 1960s, and universities were attacked, along with the Vietnam War. Universities were part of the establishment and were seen as complicit in America's bad record in imperialism, race relations, and capitalism, and whatnot. Students blamed them for being ivory towers, not relevant to the problems out there. In the 1970s, some faculty began to join the student critics. And in the 80s, postmodernism showed up, Postmodernism was an attack on cultural modernism and modernization, and on their rationalist basis. Postmodernists popularized what philosophers already knew, that there are no self-validating rational principles at the basis of all thinking. Actually, theologians like Augustine and Anselm had said as much 1,000 years earlier. They had pointed out that all thinking goes down to basic assumptions or commitments that are actually faiths. As St. Anselm put it, we have to believe in order that we may understand. The postmodernists preferred to say that all thinking is political. And so universities became politicized, at least in the humanities and social sciences. More recently, there have been other criticisms of the university for their connections to business and government, for their concentration on research rather than on students, for their massive waste of money on administration, and for their cost. Universities seem to realize that they aren't giving leadership to society. States are cutting back their budgets. Government is ignoring their advice. Students are threatening to train for their jobs some other way. I suspect that that's why universities are building up their sports programs so massively to help their popularity. Seriously. Title IX helped with this, evening out the gender balance. American society is now largely ignoring its universities. They don't influence our politics, as you can see whenever a Republican gets elected. They aren't leading our culture. When you see the entertainment industry replacing the high culture that universities used to enshrine. They may not even be setting the scientific agenda when you see industrial research replacing basic research. They seem to have accepted the idea that they're all about job training. That's a big decline from their original hopes of being our intellectual centers. 10 years ago, I published a book called The Decline of the Secular University, and its main point was that this decline was actually caused by its secularization. Along about 1900, academics decided that religion was getting in the way of science and objective knowledge, and that it never really contributed much. And so universities sort of drifted away from any attention to religion. Unfortunately, the main result of secularization is that the university can no longer talk confidently about the human good. The human good is our ultimate value. And as theologians remind us, anyone's ultimate concern is what we mean by their religion. You may not think you have a religion, but if you can identify your ultimate concern, that is your religion, sort of by definition. If you don't have an ultimate concern, you don't have a core. You're kind of lost. Now, everything the university does aims at the human good, or it wouldn't be doing it. If anybody's from the veterinary school, I'll add this. We don't doctor all animals, just those that are important to us. So we probably learn something about us from assessing the vet school curriculum. More and more students are choosing professional majors. Education, pharmacy, engineering, nursing, law, business, forestry, medicine, journalism, social work, and the like. All professional programs exist to serve some human good. And yet the university can't discuss the human good in any conclusive way. It's likely to talk about it in money terms. We know that's not the ultimate measure, but to go further would require us to use terms that are actually religious. Terms like responsibility, care, service, forgiveness, charity, judgment, love, are terms that best make sense in a personalist, actually religious discourse involving ultimate ends. They don't really make sense in the utilitarian discussions we've been having. Let me explain. When you think about it, health turns out to be a personalist term rather than a biological one. We don't talk about the health of the AIDS virus or the health of pneumonia, which are life forms after all. And likewise with sanity, wealth, justice, education. You can't follow any of these concepts to the end without realizing you're talking about something specific to humans. Without recognizing a specifically human good, universities do become trade schools. And yet recently, the secular university was denying the concept of the human in three ways. First, the social sciences have long talked of cultural relativism, meaning that our ideas and values relate to or are relative to certain social and cultural patterns. There's truth to that, but it doesn't mean you can absolutize that relativism. That would be a contradiction. It doesn't mean our values are unreal. Second, the sciences want to analyze things into their simplest elements. This is proper, but you can't take it too far. Just because everything is made up of electrical particles doesn't mean that all sciences can be reduced to physics. Each of the sciences deals in concepts that can't be reduced any further. Political science, for example, it would be nonsense to analyze democracy in terms of cell science. But reductionism is often taken to mean that we are essentially machines. And third, in the humanities, postmodernists attack the very idea of the human difference. The very concept of the human was said to be essentialist, with quotes, giving something a false reality. They even thought that humanities departments should be rebranded as cultural studies, so that it would be the culture-specific behavior of Homo sapiens. In all these ways, scholars were rubbing out the line between humans and the rest of creation. But nobody takes these dismissals seriously. We go right on thinking of ourselves as masters of the universe. We go right on writing books as if we're rational creatures. So these secularizing arguments just make the university look confused. So that's the situation in the universities right now, or a jaundiced view of them at least. But you may be wondering, why is there so much moralizing going on in our universities? If humane values are unreal, why are students fuming over things like diversity, endowment divestiture, Confederate memorials, campus rape, free speech, microaggressions? Where are all these moral distinctions coming from in a creation that has been declared pointless? Students have never been so eager to enforce their morality, it seems to me. In one way that's encouraging. The moral sense has not disappeared. But you do wonder, where is the humility we need to turn judgment on ourselves? And this brings us to the contribution, I think, Christianity can make to our secular universities. We need to start with the difference between the secular, being secular, and being secularist. A secular university is legally defined as one where religious beliefs are not enforced. It's neutral, in other words, between religion and non-religion. A secularist university is one where religious beliefs are forbidden. The U.S. Supreme Court does not permit tax-supported universities to be secularist. That would violate the Establishment Clause by making secularism our established religion. It is ruled that even primary schools can teach about religions. We just can't require students to take any particular view of them. But when you think about it, teaching about religions may be all that Christians need to do these days. Take this matter of morals. Our students have absorbed basically Christian views of history and ethics and personal relations from our culture. They don't know where these moral views came from. Their own moral views are exaggerations of certain Christian values. They exaggerate tolerance into empathy. They exaggerate charity. They exaggerate tolerance into permissiveness, and charity into empathy. They exaggerate love into promiscuity. They equate justice with equality. Pretty much all their values have Christian roots. And when they hear about other value systems, they think they're bizarre. Somebody needs to explain how our values derive from Christianity and how they fit together. And I'm afraid even Christians may need to learn this. When we dealt with moral issues in my history classes, student interest was at its height. Students could see the point of such discussions. They just hadn't recognized their religious character. Because discussions of value imply some ultimate reference. It's easy to deal with religion in history classes. I didn't require students to agree with me or necessarily tell them what I believed. The point was simply to present Christian concepts and values as real as live options. But the attraction of the Christian views was powerful. Students may imagine we've left Christianity behind, but they wouldn't recognize aristocratic values, for instance, as an alternative. And they recognize how unacceptable a naive utilitarianism is when you show its implications. In technological or scientific fields, the opportunities are not as obvious. But remember, everything the university does relates to the human being, or it wouldn't be doing it. Everything we design or build is for the sake of society. We're glad when basic research has some payoff. So a professor of materials science will have occasions to mention what she hopes will come of her efforts and the motivation that her basic beliefs gave her. Einstein used to take many occasions to mention the religious character of his motivation. So there are opportunities for Christians to share their viewpoints. The problem, of course, is that it takes courage to be ourselves in our classes and with our colleagues. And this is where Christian study centers come into the picture. For my first 30 years of teaching, I had a lot of trouble presenting any kind of Christian witness. People knew I was religious, but they didn't know what that meant exactly, and I had a hard time expressing it. But 5 years before I retired in Florida, a doctor in the medical faculty found the money to start up something like the Christian study at UVA, where he'd been an undergraduate, the Center for
Christian study.
Center for Christian Study, right. It's the, I guess, the oldest, or at least the most famous of the original, of the early ones. The beginning of this new center in Florida was very liberating to me. I could identify with something larger than myself, with other faculty and a program of activities, and for a timid person like myself, this was tremendously encouraging. All the board members there have worked up elevator speeches to explain themselves. It's not a testimony. We just say something like that. We're a group of faculty who are interested in showing how Christian concepts and values are basic to our disciplines and to the university's mission. I go on to mention that we can't discuss the human good without getting into our sense of ultimate value, which is religious by its nature. At Florida, we had a building just off campus. It was very welcoming. It had Wi-Fi and a very popular coffee bar. There were always students hanging out. There was a mathematician who held his office hours there, a Jewish mathematician who held his office hours there. There were always students hanging out. You'd see them studying, praying, counseling others. The director taught classes in Bible and philosophy and literature. He was a PhD in intellectual history, as well as being a Presbyterian minister, by the way. We had discussion groups around books. We showed films and discussed them. We invited speakers from outside. We like to invite non-Christian speakers when their expertise was relevant to what we were studying. We had Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and agnostics on panels with Christians. We were free to discuss aspects of their disciplines in ways that would have been awkward on campus. And they loved it. They loved coming back. Of course, we paid them a trifling amount, but you can buy academics very cheaply. We actually had faculty, 3 that I can think of right offhand, who were brought back to active faith by the center's influence. Our goal was to change academic culture. We did that by worming our way into the curriculum, by getting departments to co-sponsor our activities. By the time I moved away from Florida, we had co-sponsorship with 10 departments and centers. It's more by now, I'm sure. Even the advertisements for our programs got the message out that religious viewpoints had something important to add to the university's efforts. There are now about 30 such centers around the country at big institutions like Wisconsin, Yale, Cornell, Texas, and small places like Hampton, Sydney, Richmond, Bowdoin. Those that at Iowa, Duke, and UNC are brand new. They're starting new ones at Ohio State, Illinois, and Michigan. They don't have to begin with a bang. What it takes are people with a vision for their universities. You can get advice and suggestions from the established centers, but each center will be different depending on local talent, local resources, and local interests. Study centers shouldn't be in competition with student religious groups. Something called a study center probably won't be all about evangelism and fellowship. That's the job of the student religious groups. But we all know that evangelism has to start further upstream these days than it did a generation ago. Back then, more students had a religious vocabulary. Given the naive naturalism and secularism that comes to campus with them, our first job is to make students aware of their personalist assumptions. Facing up to the human difference opens a window into religious thinking. And it'll make the university's current blind spots more apparent. Evangelism can follow on that. So the goal of study centers is to make it seem natural for universities to be discussing religious ideas and religious faith. To make it seem natural to have Christian spokespersons on campus. So to sum up, universities know they're in trouble. Society isn't coming to them with their big question, with our big questions. Universities are offended when they're called trade schools, but they're not sure how to respond. Only third-rate schools still pick on Christianity as an undefended target. That's been my experience, at least. At better institutions, there's a growing openness that didn't exist in the 1960s. Things are changing. I taught at Stanford in the late 60s when the excitement was over the youth rebellion in Woodstock. Remember Woodstock? Their enormous football stadium was practically empty on game days, even though their quarterback was an All-American, Jim Plunkett. Last month I saw a Stanford game on TV. The stadium was full. We don't live in that old radical world. Our issues are different now, and our opportunities may be different. Thank you.
We have a few moments for some questions if you'd like to ask questions of Dr. Sommerville.
Yes.
Could you define or give examples of departmental sponsorship that you alluded to in your presentation?
What?
Departmental sponsorship?
Oh, co-sponsorship.
Yes.
Well, I could probably give you a list of the departments that co-sponsor.
No, but how do they engage?
Oh, well, some of them engage to the extent of helping us pay to bring speakers in.
Okay.
That's, when you're taking money from them, they believe in your...
That's what one of my concerns is. A department in a secular university sponsoring a Christian event in terms of certain
well, as I say,
misconceptions.
American law doesn't allow secularist educational institutions. They can be secular, that is to say, neutral between religion and non-religion. If you want to read up on this, what's his name? At UNC, American. He died recently. The author, it's a big, thick book, Religion and American Education. Blocking on the author's name. But no, there was never a question about whether it was appropriate for them to bring up. We were not a religious group. We were incorporated, of course, as a study center to study the influence of religion in academic scholarship. Nothing illegal about that. Other questions? It occurred to me, I hadn't defined personalism, although I used the term a couple of times. And actually, it's fairly important. There's a Catholic Christian sociologist at Notre Dame, Christian Smith. He used to be at UNC. He's been publishing several books on personalism, and most recently, he had a book called The Spiritual Project of American Sociology. Wonderful title. Came out from Oxford. The spiritual project of American sociology turns out to be, according to him, and he documents this, the promotion of the idea of humans as individualistic, unencumbered, autonomous beings who have no particular relation to other autonomous, unencumbered individualists, whereas that is not the most fruitful way to view human beings. We all find ourselves embedded in family, language, culture, community, location, and that embedding is essential, not accidental. If one of these autonomous, unencumbered individualists met another such being, they could not interact. They would not have personality. Our personality is in relation to other persons, which makes our relation to God really central, and without which our personhood may be lacking. Certainly in Christian Smith's view, it is. So that's a horse that Christians can ride into the heart of the university, I think. Yes.
Dr. Sommerville, how do you see the investigation of the dynamic of the human soul as a facet of the advance of the study center's purposes?
I don't have a really ready answer to that, but we have to realize that philosophers do talk about the soul, but the term they use for it is person.
Okay.
So I think personalism is maybe the language we could adopt in invading that territory. It's something to explore. And Christian Smith's many works would be perfect to give you a handle on that, I would think.
Does the Christian Study Center identify itself with any particular branch of Christianity, or should it be pretty all-inclusive?
That's a sensitive question, and some of them do identify with a particular local church, in fact. But the bigger ones do not. And they all, I think, in time, they all wean themselves away from that identification. If they last, it may be helpful to have a particular church behind you at the beginning. And
I didn't have in mind a particular church. I had in mind, say,
A denomination.
Catholic Study Center, or Protestant, or evangelical.
Well, the Catholics have their own.
Yeah, right.
Many of them are study centers and not student religious groups. We have one in Duke. Yes, and I think it's fruitful to partner with them when we can. But to my knowledge, none of the ones in the consortium of Christian study centers with their website, none of them identify with a particular denomination.
Do they identify with what we call evangelicalism?
Yes, a lot of them do. I don't myself call myself an evangelical because of the baggage, but that's, political baggage.
That's where I was going. So,
Yeah.
please address it.
But in our vocabulary, if you're not an evangelical, then you're a liberal.
Yeah.
And Stanley Hauerwas called me a liberal once. It shocked me. There's got to be a middle term somewhere that I would like to fit.
That's what I was wondering, if there was some less loaded word
Yeah.
that we could
We'll
use
have
to
to work on that.
describe the approach, right? Because evangelicalism has become a different.
Mainstream doesn't do it, that has baggage. In Britain, we don't can't help you.
That's a communal struggle of Christian study centers, just to put it that way.
Yeah, Linda just said, what's wrong with this Christian?
Well, mere Christianity would be the phrase I would say.
Yeah.
Is probably the best.
One of the study centers is called Mere Christianity,
Forum.
the one at Furman.
Furman, yeah.
Furman.
Can you say a little more about how your own faith has been encouraged and grown through your participation in the center?
Well, I was raised in a hyper-sectarian environment. When C.S. Lewis began publishing, it really opened the eyes of my family and my church to realize there were Christians outside of our sect, which I will go unnamed. And that led to InterVarsity, and that led to other things. And the parachurch activities just started in the 50s, it seems to me, and have grown massively since then. It's been such a blessing. And going into churches that are truly interracial is thrilling to me. Christianity is losing the stigma of its origins in America. So it's been thrilling to me, and maybe I've overdone it in my thrill at finding Christians everywhere I look. My two closest neighbors are a Catholic convert and a Southern Baptist, and I enjoy them enormously, both of them. I hope they enjoy me as much. That's not an answer, I'm sorry. I gave you a history. I'm a historian, but not self-reflective.
One more, anyone?
Well, let's thank Dr.